In medieval European history, war did not take place only on the battlefield. It spread into everyday civilian life through prolonged hunger and deprivation. Many people did not die from direct blows in combat, but collapsed as food supplies ran out. Crops were destroyed and livelihoods were shattered after prolonged conflicts. Wars often lasted for months, even years, severely disrupting food production. Fields were abandoned, livestock was stolen or slaughtered, and granaries became the first targets of moving armies. For ordinary people, the most dangerous enemy was not the opposing soldiers, but the gradual disappearance of daily food. Hunger crept into every village and every household, killing slowly, yet more surely than any blade. Soldiers themselves did not escape this fate, as supply lines were cut and they were forced to survive through plunder. Medieval warfare was therefore a form of total destruction in which the boundary between the battlefield and civilian life nearly disappeared. Major battles occupied only brief moments in time, while the consequences of hunger lasted through many consecutive seasons. Famine often erupted after wars, but in reality, its seeds were sown from the very first days of conflict. People were forced to confront an invisible, yet persistent enemy that could not be defeated by force. War did not end when fighting stopped. It continued in empty meals and barren tables. Seen through this lens, the true cruelty of medieval war lay in what it took away afterward. Hunger became a silent weapon causing widespread death without the need for direct combat. From this perspective, war appears less as a series of heroic victories and more as a catastrophe of survival. It is from these quiet consequences that we must look more deeply into how war destroyed food supplies. Fields turned into battlefields marked the beginning of long chains of hunger and deprivation. In medieval warfare, farmland was often the first victim, as it was the direct source of sustenance for both armies and the surrounding population. Wherever armies moved, they trampled crops, burned hayfields, and destroyed irrigation embankments to prevent the enemy from resuming cultivation. The destruction of farmland was not only meant to seize immediate food supplies, but also to exhaust the long-term capacity of occupied regions to recover. Fields burned bare could not be replanted for months, sometimes extending into the following year. Peasants were forced to abandon their land, as staying meant being robbed, coerced into labor, or killed. When the farmers disappeared, the land quickly fell into neglect, reducing productivity even after fighting temporarily subsided. Livestock was slaughtered or driven away, eliminating draft power and making renewed cultivation nearly impossible. A field without animals or labor could not be restored in the short term. War thus destroyed not only the current harvest, but also many future seasons. Even regions not directly involved in fighting suffered as refugees and passing armies moved through. Abandoned farmland spread widely, creating large-scale gaps in food production. As output declined sharply, food prices soared rapidly, pushing the poor into hunger. This shortage could not be offset through trade, as commerce was also disrupted by war. Hunger therefore spread from village to village like a silent epidemic. Land that once sustained communities became the very cause of prolonged misery. The devastation of farmland shows that medieval warfare struck at the very roots of survival. From these ravaged fields, attention must turn to granaries and wartime storage systems. It was the depletion of stored food supplies that ultimately pushed hunger beyond recovery. In medieval warfare, granaries were strategic targets because whoever controlled food supplies controlled the survival of a region. Armies frequently raided grain stores, storage pits, and warehouses, seizing or destroying anything that could sustain the enemy. The destruction of granaries was not merely looting, but a deliberate effort to plunge local communities into despair and collapse. Food reserves built up for the winter could vanish in just a few days of plunder. Once reserves were stripped away, people lost the safety buffer needed to endure the harsh months ahead. Many families were forced to consume what remained in a short time, knowing that nothing would be left afterward. The collapse of granaries spread fear rapidly, driving villagers to abandon their homes in search of refuge elsewhere. Waves of refugees increased pressure on food supplies in regions that had not yet been devastated. Cities closed their gates and restricted outsiders in order to protect their own reserves. Those turned away were forced to wander, surviving on foraging or begging. Granaries sustained not only civilians but also soldiers during wartime. When stores ran dry, troops were compelled to find food through plunder of the surrounding countryside. This created new cycles of destruction, stripping regions down to exhaustion. Reserves accumulated over many years could be wiped out in a single campaign. The collapse of granaries shows that war struck directly at the foundations of long-term survival. Hunger, therefore, did not arrive suddenly, but was gradually prepared through the emptying of storehouses. From the destruction of granaries, attention must turn to the fragile supply systems of medieval armies. It was the breakdown of supply lines that caused soldiers to starve no less than civilians. In medieval warfare, military supply systems were extremely fragile, relying heavily on local foraging and food seized from the lands armies passed through. Armies rarely carried enough provisions for long campaigns, as transportation was costly and supply convoys were vulnerable to attack. As the forces advanced deeper into enemy territory, supplies quickly ran out, forcing soldiers to survive by looting the surrounding countryside. The search for food weakened discipline as soldiers scattered far from camp in small groups to forage. Those unable to secure enough food gradually became exhausted, losing combat effectiveness even before encountering the enemy. Hunger eroded morale, making desertion and disobedience increasingly common in prolonged campaigns. Many armies collapsed not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could no longer sustain themselves. Starving soldiers became a burden, slowing marches and increasing disease within the camps. When supply lines broke down, commanders were forced to choose between retreat or pressing on in a state of severe depletion. Both choices carried serious consequences, prolonging suffering and instability. Soldiers who died from hunger were often unrecorded, yet their numbers were significant in medieval wars. Hunger thus killed silently within the ranks of those who carried weapons. War did not distinguish between civilians and soldiers once food disappeared. The fragility of supply systems shows that medieval warfare depended on the continual extraction of resources from the surrounding environment. When nothing remained to be extracted, both armies and civilian populations faced the same fate. From the exhaustion of soldiers, attention must turn to prolonged siege warfare and its consequences of starvation. It was these sieges that turned hunger into a deliberate and active weapon in medieval war. A besieged fortress was typically completely cut off from external food supplies. Those inside were forced to rely on stored provisions that were usually sufficient only for a limited time. As the siege dragged on, food gradually ran out and rations were reduced to the bare minimum. The inhabitants were compelled to consume things that would not normally be considered food. Livestock were slaughtered early on, followed by smaller animals, and eventually even seeds reserved for planting. Hunger weakened the body, allowing disease to spread rapidly in the confined and overcrowded space. Children and the elderly were often the first victims of prolonged starvation. Defending soldiers suffered the same fate, losing their ability to fight long before the enemy launched an assault. Many fortresses surrendered, not because their walls were breached, but because they could no longer sustain their population. For the besieging force, starvation was a highly effective and far less costly tool than direct combat. They waited patiently, knowing that time was on their side. This strategy turned famine into an inseparable element of medieval warfare. Death came slowly but inevitably, planting deep despair among those trapped inside. Siege warfare thus represented a form of prolonged violence where suffering accumulated day by day. From the starving fortresses, attention must turn to the wider consequences for the surrounding countryside. It was the devastation left in the aftermath of sieges that caused hunger to persist long after the fighting had ended. When fighting ceased, hunger did not disappear with the clash of weapons. Instead, it continued to haunt civilian life during a fragile and deeply unstable peace. Fields left abandoned during the war required many growing seasons to recover if there were still enough people and livestock left to cultivate them at all. Farmers returning to their villages often faced barren land, ruined homes, and empty granaries after months of looting and destruction. Livestock, once essential for plowing and transport, had been slaughtered or driven away, making cultivation extremely difficult. Without sufficient seed grain, people were forced to plant sparingly, accepting poor harvests from the very beginning. Families that had lost their primary laborers endured prolonged hunger, even though the war had officially ended. Post-war hunger spread quietly, not as violently as during active conflict, but more persistently, and with fewer avenues of escape. Survivors had to share their scarce food supplies with returning refugees, further increasing the pressure on survival. Many villages were completely exhausted, unable to recover on their own, and gradually abandoned over the years. Peace thus became a trial no less severe than war itself, as people were forced to rebuild from an empty foundation. Prolonged hunger weakened community health, making disease outbreaks more likely in conditions of poor sanitation. Children born after the war grew up in deprivation, carrying the consequences of malnutrition throughout their lives. Memories of hunger ran deep, shaping cautious habits of hoarding, restraint, and constant fear of renewed upheaval. Hunger became a lasting element of the post-war world, silently molding social behavior and collective psychology. Through these consequences, it becomes clear that medieval warfare had no clear boundary between war and peace. From post-war, hunger attention must turn to how people adapted in order to survive under prolonged, harsh conditions. These survival strategies reveal both the resilience and the limits of medieval society. Faced with prolonged hunger, medieval people were forced to change their daily routines and eating habits in order to sustain life under increasingly harsh conditions. They reduced daily rations, dividing meals into smaller portions to stretch their remaining food supplies for as long as possible. Many families turned to foods that had previously been rarely consumed, attempting to compensate for shortages in their regular diet. Tree roots, wild fruits, and forest herbs became temporary sources of sustenance for communities cut off from normal supplies. Foraging required knowledge passed down through generations, as not all plants were safe to eat. Mistakes in food selection could lead to poisoning, but hunger compelled people to accept such risks. Some families hid seed grain, even knowing that planting would be difficult, while warfare had not fully ended. Those who still owned small livestock tried to preserve them for milk or long-term food rather than slaughtering them immediately. Village communities sometimes shared food, helping the most vulnerable households survive the harshest periods. However, as scarcity persisted, cooperation gradually gave way to competition for survival. Theft of food increased, eroding trust and weakening social bonds within communities. People were forced to balance moral values against survival instincts in countless small decisions. These adaptive measures did not eliminate hunger, but they prolonged life day by day. Hunger compelled people to become flexible, inventive, and at times cruel, even toward their own neighbors. Through these adaptations, the limits of endurance and survival within medieval society become clear. From the population's struggle to survive, attention must turn to the role of the ruling elite during wartime famine. Decisions made at the top profoundly shaped the fate of thousands of people below. Many lords prioritized feeding their own armies first, requisitioning food from villages regardless of the consequences for local civilians. Such requisitions were often carried out by force, causing the peasants' already limited reserves to be depleted after only a single campaigning season. Some lords attempted to regulate food distribution in order to keep the population alive and preserve long-term agricultural production. However, these efforts were rarely sufficient, as prolonged warfare exceeded both administrative capacity and available resources. In many cases, lords abandoned the countryside, retreating to fortified strongholds along with their private food stores. This disparity fueled resentment, making ordinary people keenly aware of the injustice embedded in the feudal order. The decision to open or withhold granaries could save thousands of lives or condemn them to slow death by starvation. In some regions, lords distributed food to maintain loyalty, but such reserves could not be sustained for long. When granaries ran empty, authority weakened as well, since there was nothing left to exchange or control. Failures in food management pushed many areas into chaos, sparking unrest and famine-driven revolts. Starving populations rose up to seize granaries, shattering the already fragile wartime order. Hunger thus became not only a matter of survival, but a severe political challenge. Feudal power revealed its clear limitations when it failed to protect the population from starvation. Through the actions of the lords, hunger can be seen as a direct consequence of decisions made from above. From this intersection of power and responsibility, attention must turn to how famine reshaped medieval social structures. The upheavals caused by food shortages left deep and lasting marks on community order during wartime. When food shortages persist, the fabric of medieval communities begins to fracture as social bonds, once sustained by shared obligations and mutual support, can no longer hold. Extended families gradually shrink, with individuals forced to prioritize personal survival over communal responsibilities that once defined life before wartime. Impoverished villages lose the ability to sustain themselves, pushing residents to abandon their homes in search of other means of survival. Streams of migrants appear along dirt roads, carrying fragile hopes of finding places where food and safety still exist. This movement increases pressure on neighboring regions, where food reserves are already limited and easily depleted. Cities close their gates and restrict entry to protect their granaries from waves of starving refugees. Those turned away are forced to wander, surviving on begging or foraging, constantly exposed to danger. Hunger shatters the old social order, leading to rising theft and violence in an already unstable society. Trust between people erodes as everyone fears losing the little food they have left. Feudal obligations weaken when lords can no longer offer protection or security. The breakdown of community reduces the ability to recover after war, prolonging hardship and deprivation. Many regions are permanently abandoned, lacking enough people to resume cultivation. Famine-driven migration reshapes population maps, leaving social voids that are difficult to fill. These upheavals leave collective memories of insecurity and loss that persist for generations. Through this disintegration, it becomes clear that hunger not only kills individuals, but destroys the very foundations of society. From these migrating populations, attention must turn to how disease spreads under conditions of malnutrition and chaos. It is this widespread physical weakness that opens the door for new disasters to follow in hunger's wake. When hunger persists during medieval warfare, the human body becomes severely weakened, drastically reducing resistance and opening the way for disease to spread throughout communities. Malnutrition leaves people emaciated and vulnerable to fevers, diarrhea, and infections that are difficult to treat under limited medical conditions. Crowded settlements, especially those filled with refugees, become ideal environments for diseases to spread rapidly. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and unburied corpses further worsen the spread of illness. Children and the elderly suffer the most as their bodies lack the strength to withstand prolonged hunger. Starving soldiers in military camps are also highly susceptible to disease, reducing combat effectiveness and causing internal panic. Disease spreads faster than news, silently instilling fear in populations already exhausted by war. Many people die not from wounds but from illnesses that would be considered minor in times of peace. Caring for the sick becomes nearly impossible when families no longer have enough food or strength to endure. Hunger and disease combine into a deadly spiral that is extremely difficult to halt during prolonged warfare. Epidemics often erupt after sieges and large-scale migrations driven by famine. They rapidly reduce populations, leaving villages empty and farmlands abandoned. Memories of disease become inseparable from hunger, embedding fear of war deep into the collective psyche. Through disease, it becomes clear that hunger does not only kill directly, but amplifies every other threat. War thus spreads death through many channels, with hunger serving as the most dangerous gateway. From the spread of disease, attention must turn to how memories of hunger are preserved in medieval society. It is these memories that later shaped how people understood war and survival. In medieval society, memories of hunger did not fade when wars ended, but continued to live on in stories, habits, and the quiet fears of communities. Survivors passed down accounts of times of scarcity to their descendants as warnings about the fragility of life. Fear of hunger led people to maintain habits of stockpiling, frugality, and avoiding waste even during the rare periods of peace. Meals became moments of remembrance, recalling harsh years when every bite had been paid for with suffering. In collective memory, war was inseparable from images of empty granaries and desolate villages. Religious sermons often invoked hunger as a trial sent to test communities, reinforcing ideals of endurance and patience. The lingering fear of starvation shaped how people viewed power and the responsibilities of those who ruled. Lords who failed to protect their people from hunger were remembered as symbols of failure. These memories eroded trust, leaving communities perpetually wary of the outbreak of new conflicts. Even during years of good harvests, joy was tempered by anxiety for past experience, taught that abundance rarely lasted. Rituals of praying for good harvests and sharing food took on deeper meaning after years of famine. They became ways to soothe fear and reinforce social cohesion. Memories of hunger thus shaped medieval culture, habits, and collective psychology. Through these memories, war was not merely a historical event, but a lived experience etched deeply into human lives. Hunger became a lasting symbol of the suffering caused by war. From this collective memory, the discussion can close with a broader view of the role of hunger in medieval warfare. It was hunger that transformed war into a catastrophe of survival far beyond the battlefield. Looking back at medieval warfare, hunger emerges as a silent force of destruction, creeping into every corner of daily life and killing more slowly yet more widely than any blade. Without the need for direct combat, starvation shattered health, exhausted communities, and turned once fertile lands into wastelands for many years. Military victory did not mean safety, as survivors still faced devastated fields and empty granaries. Hunger did not distinguish between victor and vanquished, civilian and soldier. All suffered the same consequences when food disappeared. Armies withdrew, leaving behind an exhausted society where reconstruction was slow and deeply painful. Memories of starvation lasted longer than memories of battles, embedding themselves in habits, fears, and the way people understood war. Seen through this lens, medieval warfare appears not as a sequence of heroic victories, but as a chain of survival losses stretching across generations. Hunger became the most truthful measure of brutality because it continued long after the clash of weapons had faded. Surviving communities learned to live frugally, to store food, and to constantly prepare for the next upheaval. War therefore never truly ended in the lives of ordinary people. It persisted in meager meals, in collective memory, and in the constant anxiety about tomorrow. Understanding this allows us to view medieval war with clarity rather than romanticizing violence, for the most dangerous enemy was not the sword-wielding foe on the battlefield, but the silent hunger standing behind every conflict. It was hunger that transformed war into a catastrophe of survival far beyond the battlefield, and that remains the most devastating legacy medieval warfare left to humanity.